Hello. Hi, my name is Tim. I'm not Pastor Daniel. And, I am peers. For those of you in A2F that don't know me, I'm peers with Mike Park and Sam Kim, class of 2011. And Nick Yu over there. Actually, I just wanted to start with sharing a story about me and Mike back, just to give you a little sense of our history. Well, I don't know what you guys think of Mike Park, but then the way we thought of Mike Park was there's like these three circles here, and then this is Korea, this is Bruce Lee, and then this is a Mustang, and then Mike Park's right in the middle here. And that's the way we viewed Mike Park. I know. But then just one story is our senior year, it was our last set of finals, second semester, and then we're studying, it's 4 a.m., and we're studying at Dana House, and then Mike Park looks at me and he's like, let's bike to the marina right now. And I'm like, what? Why would we do that? It's like, this is our last finals. We'll never do this again. And then I was like, okay. So we grabbed those random bikes downstairs in the basement. I don't know if they're still there, but we just biked all the way to the marina, and then we watched the sunset. But then we didn't, it was nice. But then what we didn't realize was on the way back, actually, cars started coming in, and we're trying to bike over that bridge on the way to the marina, and then the cars are coming in at like 60 miles per hour, and so we almost died because the cars would come like right in between. And anyways, it was a painful journey back. But that was me and Mike Park, and then so this is my family. Lydia's my wife. We're with the freshman class in Coin. This is my son Luke. He was Captain America. I don't know if you can see that. He's Captain America for Halloween. So today we're going to be talking about the Exodus, the actual Exodus, when Israel finally leaves Egypt. If you remember back in chapter 3, God told Moses at the burning bush moment, right? He says, "I have surely seen the affliction of my people. I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians." And it took 10 plagues. It was a long, drawn-out struggle. We've been covering Exodus since the beginning of the semester, right? And but through all of that, finally, this is the fulfillment. God is fulfilling His promise to bring Israel out. Not only that, not only is this the fulfillment of God's promises, but if you look at the whole Bible, you'll find that this Exodus is one of the most significant moments in the entire Bible. It immediately becomes the relationship-defining moment. It defines the relationship between God and Israel forever. God never moves on from this. And we see this because in pretty much every subsequent book in the Old Testament, God keeps mentioning the Exodus. Here's just a quick survey. I'm not going to read all this, but in Deuteronomy, He says, "I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery." Joshua, "And I sent Moses and Aaron, and I plagued Egypt with what I did in the midst of it, and afterward I brought you out." Over and over again, pretty much every book, God refers back to the Exodus. And someone might ask, is God just being naggy about this? Why does He seem so stuck in the past by continuing to mention the Exodus hundreds and hundreds of years after the event? But if we think about it, I think really significant moments have a way of never fading because they were actually that big. For example, like Independence Day. I don't think people it's the moment that changed the course of our country forever, and you don't hear people say, "Hey man, can you just cut it out?" on the fireworks. It was hundreds of years ago, man. Just move on. People don't say that because it was actually that big. And when we look at the impact of the Exodus, when we look at that impact that it had on the relationship between God and the Israelites, as well as the historical impact, we see that the Exodus was actually that significant. It meant that they were no longer slaves. It meant that they are now a nation of themselves. And the series of events associated with the Exodus, the plagues, the splitting of the Red Sea that we're going to cover today, it all told the world that not only is there a God, but that Israel was God's chosen people. And this is a significant event. And when I think about why the Exodus was significant, I find myself relating to this. I realize that as a Christian, I have an Exodus moment with God as well. It's the moment when I realized that the cross was the significant event for me, even though it happened over 2,000 years ago. That event defined my relationship with God. I still remember when I became a Christian, I remember being convicted, I think, for the first time of my sinfulness. I had grown up going to church, but it was at our winter retreat my freshman year, and I just remember being struck that I was a hypocrite. Growing up, people knew me as someone who went to church, but people also knew me as someone who wanted to live life just like everyone else as much as I could. Of course, there was some limit to that, right? I didn't want to get in trouble with my parents, and I didn't want to go past, my own conscience. I didn't want to feel too guilty. And as I was processing all this at the winter retreat, I was just struck by the simple conclusion that I'm messed up. I'm a sinner. I need forgiveness. I need the cross. And when that all hit me, the cross all of a sudden became the most significant moment in history for me. And that was back in 2008. But since then, what I've noticed is that the cross has gotten bigger in my life. It's a bigger deal now than before. Since then, I've grown more thankful, more in awe of the cross. And as I think about why, I see that not only is it that I've grown in seeing myself as a sinner, but each year my relationship with God has become deeper and richer. And I know that it all began on my Exodus day, the day I realized that the cross was for me. It became and still is the most significant moment in history for me. But even with this kind of important moment like the Exodus, we're going to take a look at today's passage, and what we'll find is that sometimes holding on to the commitments that we made towards God is hard. It's challenging. I think sometimes we find that we want to go back. And today we're going to take a look at two characters who had moments of recognizing truth about God, but they had fickle hearts. We're going to look at Pharaoh and the Israelites. So first, looking at Pharaoh, if you remember from last week, we talked about the 10th plague and the Passover, and we read, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborn, and then even from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captives. So even Pharaoh's son died through the 10th plague. And at the end of it, if you guys remember from last week, Pharaoh, here at verse 31, then he summoned Moses and Aaron by night and said, "Up, go out from among my people, both you and the people of Israel, and go, serve the Lord as you have said. Take your flocks and your herds, as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also." After 10 plagues, the long, drawn-out battle between God and Pharaoh finally releases the Israelites. And I think that means something. I think it means that Pharaoh finally submitted to the fact that he's not in control. He yielded to God. His pride was finally broken. But even with all of that, this is what we read in today's passage. Chapter 14, verse 5. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed toward the people. And they said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" So he made ready his chariot and took his army with him, and took 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt with officers over all of them. And the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. The Egyptians pursued them, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots, and his horsemen and his army, and overtook them, encamped at the sea. We read, the mind of Pharaoh and his servants was changed. Pharaoh changed his mind about the Exodus. What's going on here? I was thinking about this, and I think part of me thought, there's no way Pharaoh does this. How could Pharaoh do this? Is he just crazy? Is he just crazy and has short-term memory loss? How could he forget everything that just happened? How could he forget the death of his own son? Well, what does he say? He says, "What is this we have done?" Right here. What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? Pharaoh is, I think, feeling a sense of loss. He says, "We have let Israel go from serving us. They're no longer serving us." Pharaoh had benefits that no longer exist now. Who's going to make the bricks? Our entire labor force is gone. There's a cost now that he's feeling that wasn't there before. And I think it's this cost that causes him to say, "What is this we have done?" He regrets what has happened. What is this we have done? And at this point, it's just a sentiment of regret, a sense of loss. But Pharaoh doesn't leave it there. He gathers his whole army, 600 chosen chariots and all the other chariots of Egypt, his whole army, and pursued Israel. And he's now fighting to get back what he lost. He's fighting to go back to the way things used to be. And I thought it's kind of like this. Like, say there's a college student. He's living a very hedonistic lifestyle. His unspoken goal is to just satisfy any fleshly desire that comes to mind. And he has a trail of victims to show for it. And one morning, he begins to feel the hollowing out of his soul. And as he thinks about it, he's overcome with guilt about how he's lived his life. And somehow he finds his way to church, and he hears the gospel and believes, becomes Christian, praise the Lord, it's great. He renounces his old way of life and tries to live out his new convictions. And the first few weeks are great. But, a couple weeks in, some of his old friends are saying, hang out with us, come on. Let's go like we used to. But he feels like he can't because, they might drag him back to his old way of life. And at the same time, he kind of looks around and he sees that, he doesn't have many close relationships with Christians either. He starts to feel lonely. And not only that, but he's it's not like life is getting any easier for him. School's just as tough. And now his usual ways of dealing with stress are gone. And as he goes through all of this, he just feels like life didn't used to be this hard. I used to be free to do whatever I wanted. And after a few more weeks of this, he just throws in the towel. He says, what is this I have done? I want to go back to the way things were. And so he does. He changed his mind, kind of like how Pharaoh changed his mind. And he went back to the way things were. What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us? But what are they going back on? For Pharaoh, he's going back on the hard-learned truth that there is a God and that he needs to submit to him, that God doesn't compromise on these things because God won't perpetuate the lie that Pharaoh is God. And I think this is a very sobering picture. And not only Pharaoh, but we read about the Israelites. The Israelites also had a fickle heart. Here's what we read, chapter 14, verse 10. When Pharaoh drew near, so Pharaoh now he's caught up with Israel. The people of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians were marching after them, and they feared greatly. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Is it because there are no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? Is not this what we said to you in Egypt? Leave us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." It would have been better for us. Just to explain a little bit, the Israelites, they're in a tough spot here. You see, they're encamped, and on one side of the encampment, there's the Red Sea, right? And on the other side, Pharaoh's whole army is coming at full speed, and they're now in visible distance. And we're talking, it's whole families here, and like the whole age range. We read that there's over 1 million of them, so the chances of them running away from this situation is pretty slim. They're in a tough spot. And this situation is probably not what they were expecting when they were thinking of being freed from Egypt. They weren't expecting to be in this situation. They're cornered here, which is why they say, "What have you done? What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt?" Notice these words. They're very similar to what Pharaoh said. Pharaoh said, "What is this we have done, that we have let Israel go from serving us?" And the Israelites are saying, What have you done to us in bringing us out of Egypt? What have you done? This isn't what I thought freedom would look like. This isn't what I thought following God out of Egypt would look like. In fact, I think it was better back in Egypt. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than whatever this is. My life before was better than this. I liked pre-Exodus better. And I wonder if you could relate to this. How would we say this? How would you say this? This isn't what I thought Christian life would look like. I'm starting to think that my life was better before I became a Christian. Maybe my life was better before I made certain commitments to follow God. What is this I have done? Can you relate to this? And I wonder how that sentiment gets worded in your mind. And I think it's a sobering question, something that we need to think about and consider. But when we take a step back and we look at the Exodus narrative, what we find is that what we've covered so far, it's not the whole story. There's something else going on here. In chapter 13, verse 17, we read, "When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by way of the land of the Philistines, although that was near. For God said, 'Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt.' But God led the people around by the way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, and the people of Israel went up out of the land of Egypt equipped for battle. And the Lord went before them by day in a pillar of cloud to lead them along the way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, that they might travel by day and by night. The pillar of cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night did not depart from before the people." What we read is that ever since the Exodus, whether the Israelites recognized it or not, God was leading them very intentionally. God was concerned that if the path that they took was too difficult, they'll have a change in mind. Right? We read, "Lest the people change their minds when they see war and return to Egypt." So the picture of God here is that he's very thoughtful about how much the Israelites can handle. And because of that, he very deliberately leads them night and day, step by step, through a pillar of cloud and a pillar of fire. And the picture just kind of reminded me of when my son first started walking. He only knew, I wouldn't even call it walking, he was just hobbling, and he only knew how to go forward. So I would watch him, and he's just kind of hobbling forward, and then if I saw he's going somewhere dangerous, like the stairs, I would just pick him up and then move him, and then he would just continue to hobble, right? He had no idea. I just saved his life, He would have just gone down the stairs right away. And that picture kind of reminded me of this. I think this is what we see God doing with the Israelites. Don't go that way. Let's go this way, guys. And I think what this tells us is that God didn't abandon Israel after the Exodus. God didn't leave them to fend for themselves. But God is very deliberately leading them, giving them exactly what they can handle. And I think this is a consistent description of God in the Bible. In 1 Corinthians 10, we read, "God is faithful. He will not let you be tempted beyond your ability, but with the temptation, he will also provide the way of escape, that you may be able to endure it." God is faithful. He is very intentional about allowing us to experience only what he thinks we can handle. And I think this challenges the Israelites' fear, because knowing that God is intentionally leading your life is huge. It makes a big difference. It's the difference between trying to get a job at Apple on your own versus getting a job at Apple with, say, Tim Cook personally guiding you step by step. It makes a big difference. God was leading the Israelites the whole time. But not only was God directing the path, but we also read that God wanted to help the Israelites remember all that he did to bring them out of Egypt. After the Exodus, the first things we read about are God establishing 3 memorials: the Passover, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, and the consecration of the firstborn. And then the first two are holidays, and the third one's a ritual. And we're not going to go into detail about what was involved in each of these, but it's just important to note that these memorials were essentially holidays that were built into the calendar, right? Or like this one, a ritual that you did on a regular basis. So every year, Israelites would celebrate the Passover. They would celebrate the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And every time there was a firstborn, they would sacrifice to redeem the firstborn. And I think the question is why? Why would they do this? And here's what God says. When he's describing the Feast of Unleavened Bread, he says, "It shall be to you as a sign on your hand and as a memorial between your eyes, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. For with a strong hand the Lord has brought you out of Egypt. You shall therefore keep the statute at its appointed time from year to year. And for the consecration of the firstborn, he says, it shall be as a mark on your hand or frontlets between your eyes. For by a strong hand the Lord brought us out of Egypt." These memorials were supposed to be a way to remember the Exodus, a way to remember that by a strong hand the Lord brought them out. It's a way that you won't forget what the Lord did to the Exodus. And it was just a small reminder for me of how I view the regular things that we do each week, like Sunday service, DT, prayer. And I think one way to think about it is it's like this. It's a reminder for me to think back on who God is and my history with God, to remember. And I think God had a feeling that Israel would need reminders of what he did in Egypt to bring them out. And I think that's exactly what Israel needed at this moment when they're trapped next to the Red Sea with Pharaoh and his whole army coming at them at full speed. And it's at this moment, knowing the full picture of what God has been doing, Moses, right, they're at the Red Sea, Pharaoh's army is coming. They just told Moses, what have you done in bringing us here out of Egypt? And Moses reminds them, the scared Israelites, he reminds them of this very truth. Here's what he says in chapter 14, verse 13 to 14. He says, "And Moses said to the people, 'Fear not, stand firm, and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent.'" These words are the words that Israel needed to hear when they were having a change of heart towards God. And I think these are the words that we too need to hear when we feel ourselves having a change of heart. When we hear ourselves saying, "What is this I have done?" These words are the prescription for our fickle hearts. Fear not. Don't let your fears determine what you will do, but quiet your fears. Stand firm. Don't be swayed. Don't go back on your commitments, but remember them. Remember the history of how God led you. Remember your testimony. Remember the reason that convinced you to follow God in the first place. Nothing has changed. God is still God. The Bible is still just as reliable. Stand firm. See the salvation of the Lord. Look around. God is at work right now. Remember the baptism testimonies that we heard just a few weeks ago. God is working. The Lord will fight for you. God brought you to this point, and he's not going to abandon you now. You're not alone. And you have only to be silent. Be silent. Quiet the voices of complaint. Quiet the voices of doubting God. And quiet the voices of fear about how your life will turn out. The Lord will fight for you. So just be silent. And these words, it seemed to have woken Israel up. Because what we read is that they didn't run. They didn't panic. They stayed and waited on God. I think one other thought on this is that I think it would have been hard for the Israelites to say these words to themselves. They needed a Moses to remind them of all this. And I think sometimes we need people in our lives who can speak these words to us. And often I think it does come through the Moses in our lives. People who are in the position to speak God's words of truth to us when we are in the thick of our fears. And as Israel listens to these words, God moves. We read in chapter 14, verse 16, God says, "Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea and divide it, that the people of Israel may go through the sea on dry ground." And Moses does this. The Red Sea splits in two, and to give them time to cross, God sends a pillar of cloud and fire behind the Israelites to hold back the Egyptian army. And the Israelites enter into the split Red Sea and walk on dry ground. And as they finish crossing, all 1,000,000 of them, Pharaoh's army is released, and they go after Israel through the sea. And here's what we read. "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Stretch out your hand over the sea, that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots, and upon their horsemen.' So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and the sea returned to its normal course when the morning appeared. And as the Egyptians fled into it, the Lord threw the Egyptians into the midst of the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the horsemen of all the host of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained." See the salvation of the Lord. And here's how the chapter ends. Thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians. So the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. As the Israelites see the salvation of the Lord and experience God to be faithful, their belief in the Lord grows. And as we wrap up, I just want to visualize this moment, right? The Israelites, they cross the Red Sea, and as they go forward, the Red Sea closes behind them, right? And the way back, in a way, just closed. I think it symbolizes the closing of the old way of life, how they used to live in Egypt. It symbolized the closing of that for Israel. But even though there's this closing off, if you take a step back and look at what's going on, God is taking Israel out of slavery, out of bondage, and sending them forward to the promised land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, a good land. Through the closing of doors, God is trying to bless the Israelites with freedom. But for Pharaoh, we read that he only wanted to go back to the way things were. He couldn't bear the cost of what he felt was lost. And he brought his whole army to fight, to get back what he felt like he once had. And so there's these two pictures, right? Pharaoh, who's unable to move forward, who's stuck in the past, and Israel, whose way back is closed off, but is looking forward to the promised land, to a good land. So maybe in the midst of all this, maybe the question to ask is, where is God trying to take us? Where is God trying to take you? What's been the destination all along? God has freedom in mind. He freed the Israelites from slavery. He's bringing us to a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. This is what we read in Jeremiah. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. Maybe instead of looking back, we need to look forward to the future that God has in store for each of us. So just as the band comes up, I just want to give you guys some space to think for yourself where you're at with all this. Maybe you could answer the question, where's God trying to take you? What's been the destination all along? And even if you're experiencing difficulty in your commitments to God, what else has been true? How has God led you? What is God wanting you to remember about him, about your personal history with him? Right? For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope. So I just want to give you guys some space to think about these things, and as you feel ready, maybe you can pray to God quietly, whatever it is that came to mind.